right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Senate Utilities Committee, and it is a pro forma day on the Senate floor. We will be heading down that way at 2:30 regardless to take care of some business down there. I'm going to hold any bill introductions until the rest of the committee gets here, so at least we have a quorum. I do believe we have some online, but they need to be in the committee room for that. And for this week, we have several good things on the agenda. We've got tomorrow we have an informational brief from the Kansas Corporation Commission on the rate report. This is a bill that we passed last year, actually an agreement we passed last year, so that we would kind of get an overview of the electrical rates in Kansas. Came to an agreement last year that they, KCC would provide that report for us every year, so tomorrow's that. Wednesday, we're going to have a hearing on Senate Bill 323, and then Thursday, hearing on 324, and then no meeting will be scheduled on Friday. So today, we're very fortunate to have an overview of the independent telecom companies in Kansas. Catherine Moyer is the CEO and GM of Pioneer Communications out in Ulysses, Kansas. So I will turn the floor over to you, Catherine.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Is it possible to know who's on the line virtually, or?
Let's find out here. Who do we have online?
We have Bowers, Carly Humes, Dennis Pyle, and Tom Hawk.
Okay, so we have 3 senators online watching in, as well as the ones here, and I think there's a couple more stuck in an elevator somewhere.
Oh gosh, I hope not.
From what I'm told. So.
All right.
All righty. Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Chairman Thompson. As he already said, I'm Catherine Moyer with Pioneer Communications out in Ulysses, Kansas. Made the trek up yesterday, caught the very end of the Chiefs game. So fortunately, the good part, right, where they won. I actually didn't expect to be the only person testifying today. So I'm going to tell you, I've got some material I'm going to go over, but I don't expect to take the full time by any means. You have 4 pages of submitted testimony in front of you. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to kind of highlight some things. Talk through several issues from our standpoint, from the RLEC standpoint. I'll defer to you, Mr. Chairman, but I'm willing to take questions during the testimony or afterwards, whatever your preference is.
I think we'll hold until afterward. Okay. Let you go through your stuff, and then anybody has any questions, we'll open it up.
Okay, sounds great. So I'm here today as part of the Communications Coalition of Kansas. CCK represents the rural local exchange carriers in Kansas. I'm going to call them RLECs from here on out, but basically those are the independent small phone companies and internet companies throughout Kansas. So there's 34 of us. We serve 104 of the 105 counties. Wyandotte County is the only exception. We serve more than 50% of the landmass of Kansas and about 15% of households. So that tells you something. We're pretty sparsely populated, those areas that we do serve. So to give you a little illustration, I'm going to talk a little bit about Pioneer service territory. I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call our certificated service territory first, where we have regulatory requirements to serve. And then I'm going to talk about some of the other places Pioneer serves after that, which aren't highly regulated like this is. But for our regulated part, we have 5,000 square miles. We have 2 customers per square mile. But if you take into account how our population is, we have 81% of our customers living in what I'm going to call population centers. So I won't go as far as to call them all cities and towns because it's like Ulysses, but also like Big Bow and Kendall and Coolidge, very small communities. So 81% of our customers live in those communities. So if you take those out and we just look at the rest of the service territory, we drop down to about 0.5 customers per square mile. So very sparsely populated. So the 81% resides in 15 square miles of that 5,000 square miles. So the remaining 19% of our customers reside in 4,985 square miles. So again, sparsely populated. But the 81% utilizes about 375 of our total route miles, which is 14% of our network, and the remainder of the 19% has 86% of our route miles. So basically a very small number of our customers utilize a substantial portion of our network. Cost, obviously, to serve these is very expensive. The more customers you have, I mean, this is economics, the more customers you have, the more people you can spread the cost to, obviously makes sense, but makes it very expensive. So The RLECs are also the carriers of last resort. So carriers of last resort are required by law to provide service to any customer who wants voice service in our service territory, regardless of where they live, regardless of where our network is, and regardless of whether it's economically viable to serve those people. Basically, that was established so that people could get service, because competition by itself won't necessarily guarantee service to those folks. So it basically ensures a model that makes sure that there is some sort of business plan to get service to their customers. So there is a common misperception that I guess that landlines are just totally falling off the cliff. And yes, we have seen a decrease in landlines, but I'll tell you that that's pretty much stabilized here recently. There is still a substantial portion of parts of Kansas that don't have cell service. It just doesn't work. So in that case, people keep their landlines and they have landline availability. Also, we provide broadband on those voice networks. I mean, that's not a secret. So, you know, the voice part is the carrier of last resort obligation, but it also provides broadband. So in exchange for accepting those responsibilities, we're really highly regulated. We have a lot of regulatory requirements, but we also have access to a couple of funding sources. We have funding sources in the Federal Universal Service Fund, as well as the Kansas Universal Service Fund. Now, in 1996, the Kansas Legislature passed the Kansas Telecom Act, and I don't think the vast majority of us in this room were here in 96 when that happened. But one of the things that it did, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit technical, it required reductions in intrastate access rates. So that is basically what Pioneer would charge the long distance companies to access our network. So if someone in Chicago wanted to make a phone call to Ulysses, Kansas, they would utilize somebody like AT&T long distance, MCI back in the day, other types of long distance companies, and they would take and bring that call to Ulysses, Kansas, and they would pay something to access our network. Well, what they would pay to access our network is an intrastate access rate, but that was all based on what the cost of our network was. So it was again, economics. It was based on what the cost of the network was to maintain it and to complete that phone call. In return for reducing those intrastate access rates, which was basically to make long distance more affordable, the Kansas Legislature, as part of the 96 Act, established the Kansas Universal Service Fund. So really the purpose of KUSF was to make sure that those dollars that were going to flow into the carriers from the long distance carriers would be reduced, and KUSF dollars would make up that reduction. So it was a make whole provision, but it was revenue neutral ultimately. Ultimately, before the 96 Act and after the 96 Act, the carriers like Pioneer, it was the same amount of money. It was just some of it was coming from inter-exchange carriers and some of it was coming from KUSF after the 96 Act. But again, we continue to use those KUSF fund dollars today to do what we did with those access rates before. We build the network, we maintain the network, we service the network, we upgrade the network. In order to access those funds or the universal service funds, we have to first spend money, we have to invest in the network, and then we have to prove that we did it. Once we do that, then we are eligible to recover a part of all of those dollars that we spent from universal service and KUSF. So it's not, I think sometimes people think that they just give the carrier a bunch of money at the front end of it and say, here, go spend it. That's not how it works. What we do is we actually look at our service area, we talk to our customers, we determine what should be invested in our network and what technologies we should put in our network. We do the project. Sometimes it's internally generated funds. Sometimes we go borrow the money, but we take that money and we invest it. Only after we do that do we go back and prove that we did it. And once we prove that we did it, we're eligible to recover some of those dollars. So basically, we make the investment in the rural parts of Kansas, the sparsely populated parts of Kansas, and only after that do we actually get the money back. I will argue it's been a success story. You know, there's parts of rural Kansas that have really great service because of it. But it's not only for the customers living in Kansas, but it's also for those people who want to reach those customers. You know, your other users, the Netflix of the world, they love our network because they have additional customers, but also businesses. You know, all of the filings that we make online, all of the things that we do in that nature is heavily utilizes our network. And additionally, we serve a lot of the cell towers out in rural Kansas. So your AT&Ts and Verizons of the world usually use parts of our network to backhaul to complete the phone calls at the cellular networks. So what I've been talking about are those parts of our service territory that are really regulated. There are other parts of our service territory that aren't highly regulated, where we don't have carrier of last resort obligations and other obligations. But basically what we've found is that there are other rural parts of Kansas where we can make a business plan. Now, I will tell you in our standpoint, it's normally small communities. It's in our case, communities like Leota and Sharon Springs, where we could serve the community and make the business plan to do so, but we don't serve outside of those communities because there is, again, not the business plan to do so in those really rural parts. Again, your economics and your business cases are best served when you have a lot of customers. So what I'm going to go to now is what I think is probably can be a game changer in the state of Kansas for providing service to some of those unserved and underserved parts of rural Kansas, and that's the upcoming grants that we have access to and some very recent past grants. So you're probably all familiar with the Department of Commerce. They're doing their Broadband Acceleration Grant. That's all money that's coming from the IKE program, the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program. It's $5,000 per year for the first 3 years, $10,000 per year for the following 7 years. Obviously, a game changer because it's a 50% match, meaning you have twice the amount of money. You're all familiar with the Spark Committee. The Spark Committee has the connectivity panel. The connectivity panel has industry folks on it. They're going to make some recommendations utilizing the ARPA dollars that the state of Kansas has. And then the recently passed Federal Infrastructure and Jobs Act shipped about $42.5 billion over to NTIA, which is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. It's a federal agency that is putting together the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And the state of Kansas will ultimately get money from the BEAD program. These programs together are going to provide hundreds of millions of dollars for broadband deployment as well as adoption encouragement. The Kansas Department of Commerce worked really closely with industry when it set the Broadband Acceleration Grant Program rules. We're now in round 2 of that. They continue to work pretty closely with us. There's obviously industry representatives on the Spark Connectivity Panel, and they will obviously work very close with the Spark Committee and then obviously the Legislature to figure out what the rules are going to be and how much money will be allocated to broadband deployment from Spark. And then at the national level, the industry is currently working with NTIA because NTIA is going to set a certain amount of the rules and regulations around the BEAD money, as well as figure out how that will be deployed to each state. Because different states will get different amounts of money depending on unserved access or underserved and unserved areas and things of that nature. So NTIA will put rules around the program and then determine how to actually put out the dollars. So I'm not here to make recommendations or ask you all to make recommendations, but I want to take a few minutes just to tell you a few things that highlight, I guess, the things that we take into consideration as a carrier when we look at those dollars. So as I already mentioned, there's really not a business plan to build a network necessarily, to maintain a network and upgrade a network in a lot of parts of Kansas. Oftentimes you need a grant at the front end or perhaps something to maintain it as you go forward. But the bigger thing is what is the cost to the customer? Is it affordable? Because we could all go out and build a network, but ultimately, if the customer can't pay what it costs to get access to the network, then the network's really no good. So the affordability to the customer is a huge part of this as well. So as we go forward and look at one of these one-time grants, are the customer revenues going to be enough to make sure that network ends up being maintained and can be upgraded eventually? Because if there's not enough money to actually maintain the network, that initial investment ultimately ends up stranded because it won't be taken care of. Additionally, I'll tell you, we have to be ready to invest for the long term. Sometimes in rural parts of Kansas, it's really hard to make a business plan in under 20 years for any sort of return on your investment. So I'm going to give you, in Pioneer Communications Service Territory, we invested $750,000 just recently for 32 locations. Okay. I mean, obviously our CapEx spend is a lot more than that year to year, but the 32 locations we serve for $750,000, $23,500 per location. You start to look at an ARPU of $100 per month, you're looking at 20 years to get that investment back. Just the initial investment, not anything else that it takes to maintain it on the back end of it or in the core of the network, et cetera. So what I'm going to say is that I think that the Kansas companies, not just us, but other Kansas companies who are long established in Kansas are the companies that really are going to be here to do these things. They're going to be there to do the sparsely populated areas. They're going to be there for the long term. And they're going to be the ones who I think would be best suited to get the dollars. Now, again, I'm not asking you all to do anything about that. I'm just making a point that those are the companies that you all want to get the dollars for Kansas. We also have to do things that are scalable, because the amount of data and the growth of that data on our network has been tremendous. So I was here in 2019, and I talked about how 60% of our customers had 10-1 service, 10 megabits down, 1 megabit up. 60%, pretty large number. Today, it's less than 10%. Everybody has switched to bigger packages. So we were talking then about how 25.3 should be the standard. That should be what we should consider broadband, and that's what we should be going towards to invest in. Today, 90% of our customers are at 25 meg and higher. So that's a really short term. We're talking now about 100 meg, 500 meg, a gig. We're talking about those types of speeds because that's what customers have wanted. It happened really quickly, 3 years. So you have to be scalable. You have to be able to meet that demand. The other thing is that we've really started to see more utilization of our network. It's not just people saying, oh, I want more speed. They have a lot of connected devices. You know, if you look at like my household where it's just my husband and I, we have like 30 connected devices. That's insane, right? It wasn't the case 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. So there's the amount of data that is now traversing the network has grown incredibly. Over the past 5 years, our downstream data has grown 310%. That's where, you know, you're downloading a movie, you're watching, again, Netflix, you're downloading a document, looking at a web page. But it's not just about the download speed. That's where we were all fixated 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But now it's also about symmetrical speeds because we want the upload speed. If you think about it, during the pandemic, we all went home. Well, not all, some of us went home and started to work from home. We started school from home. We started doing doctor's appointments from home. You need upload speed. You guys have all done it. You've all done, you know, the Zoom meeting or the Teams meeting, and it's pixelated and it's terrible and everybody's broken up. A lot of times that's because the upload speed isn't good. So we've really started to talk about asymmetrical speed or symmetrical speeds of download and upload, meaning you want 25-25 or 50-50 or 100-100. Over the past 5 years, our upstream peak has grown 336%. So again, these things, the higher subscription rates, the higher speed subscription rates, the large growth in download, and the very large growth in upload show you why we need scalable networks. So again, you can't just make a one-time spend without an expectation that you're going to be able to have to maintain it and upgrade it going forward. So with that, I'm going to stop. I covered a lot of ground, but I didn't talk about other technologies. I won't pretend to be an expert, but I can definitely entertain questions about, again, other technologies, what we do, how we do it. I'm totally happy to stand for questions.
Okay, Catherine, thank you. Committee, do you have any questions for Catherine? Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. How you doing, Kat?
Ed, how are you?
Wow.
I know. It's nice to be back.
Yeah.
I think.
Both of us. My biggest challenge with all the investment in broadband is I still don't believe, and this is kind of going back a ways, we have a true, accurate map of the speeds. And, I think, we're just kind of throwing money in the wind on investment until we get a real accurate map. And we can do that. There's enough agencies, schools, cities, banks, all the players here that we could track the weak spots, but we choose not to, so we can drive the money to where it needs to be. And I thought we were going down a path, but what's your sense on that? I know that's a tough question.
No, I appreciate the question, Senator. The broadband task force that was several years ago now at this point, 2018, 2019, the Kansas Broadband Task Force talked a lot about that. And we spent a lot of time talking about mapping, and we looked at, Connected Nation did a project for the state, and there's some state agencies that have done some similar types of mapping. But none of those are totally accurate, and none of them, they were all carrier information based. So if the carrier participated, which not all carriers did, you got what the carrier said, but it wasn't always necessarily verified on the backside of it. I will tell you that the Federal Communications Commission is working on that same subject. But again, to your point, it's going to be a couple of years before you get that. And so right now, you've got hundreds of millions of dollars coming in just to the state of Kansas, much less to the entire U.S. And I think I shouldn't say everybody, a lot of states are in the same boat. I
just think sometimes it's hard to do it because there's so many players that don't want to turn over their information. And my method would have been to go out to other parties besides the phone companies, find the weak spots that way. But, yeah.
Yeah, it was a hot topic of conversation at the task force, but ultimately, for those of you that were here then, there was legislation that came out. It wasn't around mapping, but it was legislation that came from the task force that wasn't ultimately passed by the legislature.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciated the comment, about how do we know where service exists. One thing I would be interested in is working with our emergency responders, because those people who are trying to use their cell phone to get to a call, are the ones that can report what part of their county they can make that call from and what parts they can't. So, in fact, it's not just your particular customers that are relying on this service, but people who are driving through a county or, trying to say, I'm going to be an hour late, don't worry about me.
Right.
Or can you give me directions because I'm completely lost. So how does that network fit in? Because the dollars from many of those customers are not going to your company to expand the service that they're actually wanting to rely on.
Right. There is the emergency responders have a network, the FirstNet network, and I'm not going to pretend to know much about that. You should obviously talk to AT&T and a few of the other folks. But, I think as we look at it from our standpoint, we know where the towers are and we know what's being covered. And we also know that those towers have to have fiber availability in order to backhaul that, unless they have some sort of microwave transport. So, it's all interconnected. And I've said this many times in front of this committee and other committees, is that there is a whole web of solution to providing broadband. And part of it is mobile and part of it's fixed, part of it's wireless and part of it's wired. And, how to best do that. I have ideas, but that really shouldn't be, and that was part of the thing that we talked a lot about with the task force, was who should make those decisions. And it was, obviously most of us defaulted to the legislature to set the policy for the state of Kansas with the input of the carriers and those folks that are doing it. But I don't have a good answer, Senator, to your question, ultimately. I know what we do and the pieces that we do. But you are right, your emergency responders are going to be able to tell you where service is and isn't available in parts of our county, which I know because I drive it. I know where I can and can't make a phone call with my wireless phone.
So I appreciate the reference to FirstNet, but that's really just for the responders and they're being able to communicate with their dispatchers, with hospitals. So the people that are trying to call in that emergency call aren't on FirstNet. Right. They're using the regular communication network.
Correct. They're in the case, I think you're talking, it's twofold. One, you've got the wireless piece of it, which I do have. We have customers in our service territory that I know for a fact keep their landline because they can't make a cellular phone call from their house or their farm. And so they keep the landline exactly for those purposes. But yet when they travel and go to Wichita, they're using their wireless network to make phone calls, not emergency ones, but phone calls in general. So you have a whole subset of customers that know they can't get service. So they ultimately keep their landline, which is why we have the carrier of last resort obligations, because otherwise they probably wouldn't have their landline because we wouldn't serve them.
Or people like me whose mother knows when you're calling on the cell phone versus the landline.
Yeah, or that.
Reminds you she wants you to call in the landline.
Senator Peterson.
Thank you. Kind of a follow-up to Senator Francisco's. Those FirstNet towers are available to everybody, but the first responders do have priority on them. Catherine, thanks for being here. My question is, if we're looking at a federal map coming down 2 years from now, are they going to just get us a federal map that's 25.3 that'll be outdated by the time it gets here?
Ideally, the Federal Communications Commission put together its own internal task force to work on what that map looks like. And ideally, what they're going to be able to show is available speeds, not just yes or no 25.3, but rather this location or this swath of territory has access to 100, 500, a gig, whatever it might be. Ideally, that's what it's going to show. But again, part of the problem is going to be the lag in information, because anything that we submit right now that the FCC ultimately maps is anywhere from 12 to 24 months after we submit it. So carriers are going to make investments in between the time that they submit the data that's mapped.
And I really appreciate your comments about the need to be scalable with whatever we invest in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any others? Senator Fack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. This is kind of dovetailing on Senator Peterson's question a little bit. I wrote down advancement in technology. As you said here today, we got to be careful about how we spend our money because it's going to be outdated tomorrow. So as far as being cost effective or service efficient, when you talked about the 20-year repay, that's a long time with what's going on in today's world, my opinion, because it's changing so fast. So I just wondered if you may comment on that. I heard the other day where it was talking about 5G and it was mentioned 10G, that just things happening so fast. We want to be careful we don't spend millions of dollars in an area that 5 years from now is going to be obsolete. So just comment.
Right. No, I 100% agree with you. What I will tell you is, we default to fiber. I know that not every carrier is going to go there, but fiber for us is that, I won't go as far to call it future proofing, but it's definitely that scalable, and the glass in the fiber, the scalability with the electronics on the end of it allows that to be close to future proof. It allows it to be something that in 20 years is going to have the availability of faster and greater speeds depending on what we have on either end of it. I don't disagree that 5G and going eventually to 10G and whatnot, there is always a concern with how that covers rural, sparsely populated parts of Kansas. Not a wireless carrier, so you're going to have to talk to the wireless folks, but there are very small chunks of geographic coverage. Works really great here in Topeka or Kansas City. Won't necessarily work when you have 0.5 customers per square mile out in rural parts of our service territory. So there is that part of it. And that kind of goes back to my comment to Senator Francisco about the web of different services to provide different things depending on where you're at. Like I said, there's many arrows in the quiver to solve the broadband problem, and some of them are going to work really well in sparsely populated parts of Kansas and some aren't. And so it's really dependent on us to make sure as carriers that we're deploying the right technology. There's a lot of talk about Starlink and low Earth orbit satellites and things of that nature, which are doing great things. But I'm going to say that not any single one of these things that I've mentioned is the panacea or is the answer to all of rural broadband.
Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just kind of you hit it there, but really, I've toured a lot of these facilities across the state over the years. There for about 3 years, I toured them pretty hard. And, you got to put the infrastructure in place, the glass fiber. You're just changing the equipment on each end. I mean, if you go over here to AT&T's facility, you go in, that big old building, it's not real full of equipment. It used to be. It used to took the whole building, but it seems like every time they upgrade equipment, it just gets smaller. And it's the same way for you. You have these buildings that you don't use much of, but it's, you got to wire it up. You got to bring that fiber in, and the technology on the end of it's going to change. But that that's the copper was put in the ground 60, 70, 80 years ago, and it's got us to the last several years. But you can't push the capacity through it. In the modern day and age, the glass fiber is the technology we need to put in the ground. That's probably going to take us 50 years out, being able to, upload, download, do all the things we want to do. I know it's doubling or quite a bit every year. It's growing. And so, we need to think about how do we get that fiber in the ground. We'll change the boxes at the end as quick as we need to. But yeah, thank you.
No, thank you.
Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Catherine. A couple years ago, I believe you were trying a pilot project on some open bandwidth. How did that work?
So what Senator Peterson's referring to is Microsoft TV Whitespace. We were one of the initial handful. I think they did 11 or 12 outside of Scott City, north of Scott City. We did it, and it's one of the, it's again. I'm going to go. It was an arrow in the quiver. It was okay. It wasn't great. Our biggest issue was the downlinks weren't dynamic. So if we hooked up a customer that was 15 miles out from the tower that we were serving it, so TV Whitespace is it's unlicensed spectrum that was freed up when over-the-air TV moved off of the spectrum. And if you put somebody 15 miles out and we could push 6 or 7 meg to them, that meant the person that was 2 miles out was also getting 6 or 7 meg. When before we put that person on, they were getting 18, 20. And so that was our biggest issue, was that the downlink wasn't dynamic. What I will say is, so that was, 6, 7, 8 years ago. It's been a while. And so what I will say is that we ultimately abandoned the product. We did it, we stuck with it for a good year. The FCC needed to make some federal changes to make sure that some of those things could be improved. The other part of it were the equipment manufacturers, and they needed to do things as well to improve the equipment itself. I don't know anyone personally who is currently doing TV Whitespace. It is still happening, and so I have to make the assumption that if it's still happening, that the equipment's improved and the FCC has made some of the spectrum changes or some of the spectrum rule changes. It worked really well for us in line of sight, rural Scott County, where there weren't any trees. But the minute if you're familiar at all with Scott City, there's a draw sort of in the northwest part of the county. As soon as you hit that draw, everything there was not available to provide service to, because the spectrum itself just didn't go with the land. And then south to shallow water, there is a pretty nice, there's a lot of grain bins there. And on the back side of that was a customer that wanted it, and we couldn't get it to him because there was the shadow from that. Now, could have you probably gone up on the co-op grain bin and reshot it? And yes, you could have done a whole bunch of things, but we were still in the sort of trial and error. So we ultimately, again, would it work? Yeah, it did work. It worked for a while, and I have to assume that it's still working with those people that are deploying it. I really do think that, and I think that Microsoft has said this in some of the papers that they've written about it, is their ultimate use for that was not necessarily in the US. It was really for places that hadn't been developed yet. Think sub-Saharan Africa and places like that, where you didn't have network at all. And so that was some of the places that they were really aiming towards. But again, not Microsoft, so you'll have to ask them how it's going. But we ultimately abandoned the project.
Thank you. I didn't realize it'd been that long.
Yeah, I think so. I'd have to go back and actually look, Mike, to be quite honest, but it's been a while.
Time flies.
Well, the last 2 years, I don't even know where they went.
Insane. Any other questions, committee? Where do you see most of your expenditures going forward toward what type of things? What's your biggest challenges, I guess?
Our biggest challenges are definitely, we're continuing to build fiber. And for us, I still do believe that the very rural parts of our territory should still have access to fiber. It's not just a small-time farmer. It's really big, complicated precision agriculture happening. You've got dairies, you've got, feed yards, et cetera, that use a tremendous amount of bandwidth. So I do see that we're going to continue to serve them and push fiber further and further and further out. We've got fiber really deep in our territory. So now our concentration is pushing it further out and making that $750,000, expenditure for 32 locations and replicating that over and over and over. From a standpoint of actually building fiber, I would say 40% of our capital expenditures go to building fiber each year. And then there are obviously capital expenditures that go to things like upgrading the cores and things of that nature. But there's still a pretty heavy percentage of our CapEx that goes just to building fiber.
And how much of the area that you serve would you say you still have to get fiber to? Any just roughly a guess?
Oh, wow. I'm going to look at KC because I think the percentage of customers that are covered. It's like 70-something% of our customers have access to fiber. But again, this goes to the problem where I was telling you about the 80% of our people live in town and So, you know, you've got this whole swath of the geographic area where few people live that don't have fiber. They have very short loops back to fiber-fed cabinets, but they don't actually have fiber at their house. It's not very many. But again, a handful of them, yes, are just small family farms, but a huge number of them are really big, sophisticated precision agriculture farms, and that's sort of our last mile. That's where we're really trying to get to.
I guess from what I've heard, there's an overlap in the spectrum between 5G and some of the satellite technology too.
There is, and then there's obviously the concerns about the airplane 5G stuff too, and you know, there's a whole multitude of concerns, and it's just, again, it's a matter of carriers working together and solving the problem together, although we're not always often the best at that.
Senator Francisco?
Thank you. So when you're talking about this, like in future investment, can you tell us a little bit about those 32 locations where you expanded and at the cost of $750,000? I mean, so is that a farm that's trying to, you know, use the internet to track moisture in the grain, or?
Yeah. So overall, I think there were seven. I'll call them pockets within those, and like one of them was a feed yard, which where they obviously are sophisticated in tracking RFID tags on cattle and whatnot. And so they're sophisticated in that at the feed yard. But then outside of it, I think they had, you know, they obviously had a feed mill, but then they had several people that lived there. And so we're already there. We're going to go ahead and shoot you to the other 5 locations. And so those are employees that work there. One of them is some sophisticated, it's a family farm, but it's a sophisticated precision ag area. And they had asked forever and said, we're going to sign up 5 locations, and this is what we're going to, you know, these are the kind of bandwidth that we're going to have. And so we did a build there. We did another build, and again, in a pocket with farming, but then also one of the spouses teaches school, and she wanted to be able to teach school remotely. She wasn't a traditional, she was an online teacher before COVID, so not traditionally a teacher, but so she wanted it for that, and then one of the other women wanted it for her photography business. And so all of them, you know, subscribed at 50 or 100 meg, and okay, then I can, we're a co-op. We're not, you know, for us, it's not about pushing a bunch of money to the bottom line. For us, it's making a really targeted investment where our customers are going to use it and they're going to benefit from it. And in those cases, we knew that they were going to benefit. Now, we keep a running list of customers that have asked us for it, pockets of population that we know want it, and those are going to be the ones we pick off first.
Seeing no other questions, I appreciate, oh, do you have one more? Oh, sorry about that, Senator Frag.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was reading through your stuff here, you talk about the 104 of the 105 counties that you serve. Wyandotte County is the exception. Why are they the exception?
They didn't have any service territory that needed to be served by a small rural independent. I couldn't really tell you. I mean, I assume the AT&T or maybe it's CenturyLink/Lumen serves Wyandotte County, but the rest of Kansas had pockets where nobody else was willing to serve, which ended up being ours.
Or the Speedway, who knows? Hard to say, Speedway or something. Any plans on bringing back the old party line? That's what I grew up on.
Right? I mean, it's social media at its finest.
It was absolutely way ahead of its time. Seeing no other, we do have a quorum now. If there are any thank you, Catherine. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and expertise on this matter. Are there any bill introductions, either from the committee or from the audience? Seeing none, once again, we've got the KCC coming tomorrow for a brief on the rates. We've got Senate Bill 323 and 324 on Wednesday and Thursday, respectively, and no committee meeting in here on Friday. So that's the week ahead. And thank you, committee, for your work. I appreciate it very much. And with that, we are adjourned.